good, good time. Neighbor, some little children. I when they singing and the dancers really admire them. Smallness is still on their mind. Smallness is a good, good time. Neighbor, some little children. I when they singing and the dancers really admire them. Yes, they're singing. Ching, ching, ching. In a bar. See for mama. Get them fat chicken. And I should one. And she won't give me one. You see that?
All right, hey, guess what? It's back to this time again. It's Anansi Web Education, where we just bring all of the things that you need to know or to remind you about. Over the past few weeks, we were talking about the crime situation from 2000 up until all the way up until and the hundreds of people that were slaughtered and the folks who were part and parcel of those death squads and the questionable members of the Guyana police force and all manner of things. And even then, those government officials who were complicit and so forth and so on. Lots of information we were able to give to you guys, of course, while David Arthur Granger, former president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. We're back this morning. We have attorney at law. Shalon Washington is back with us. And let me just say good morning to all of them. Good morning, Mr. Granger. Good morning, Ms. Washington.
Good morning, Mark and Anthony. Good to be here again.
Good morning, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Yes, and we're glad to have you guys. Good to know that we can take this program, this discussion for the next 25 minutes or so and inform our listeners, whether in Guyana, outside of Guyana, or wherever they are. Today, these are the subjects, these are the things that we will be talking about. Why has school violence become a major public education problem? And this is something, in my opinion, that the current folks who are running the Ministry of Education seem to have a big problem on their hands. And whether they can fix it or not, I don't know. But the evidence is very, very telling. What has been the impact of school violence on children, especially in villages? And the last one we will be dealing with today is how can school violence be eradicated, especially in villages? And so those are the three questions we will have answered. Mr. David Arthur Granger will take the first shot at this here. I know during our time back in school, my time back in school on the quarantine, we had our little problems, our little, mango pelting at each other. But not today. It's no longer mango. It's nothing at all. It's bigger than that. It's more violent. And so the question, Mr. Granger, why has school violence become a major public education problem? Something you started to address when you were president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana.
Thank you, Mark. I think this is an important program committed to education, and it is not separate and distinct from what we've been discussing in previous weeks. We pointed out that there is a secondary impact to violence, and that violence, which we know as the Troubles in the first decade of this millennium, has had a knock-on effect, and many of the children now are really products of the violence. Their parents were involved in the violence, and they went to school seeing bodies in the trenches, floating in the trenches, and they're still subject to some form of police violence and roughing up, as we saw in Mocha Arcadia, and particularly what school children saw on the 6th of March 2020 at Bushot Village in Region 5 during the PPP disturbances. When children see that, the 4 children who were in the school bus, when they remember that this is the school bus, they were not involved in elections, they were not involved in any form of protest. So we see that we're living under the shadow of the Troubles and under the shadow of the PPP violence. The other thing I would mention now is that there seems to be an engineered conflict between the government and the teachers union. Now, you cannot exclude the teachers union, from solving problems in the teaching profession. And I think what is taking place now is that the union feels it's being marginalized and it's undermined. But we're talking about 11,000 teachers, you know. So this is a manufactured crisis. There is a state, we should declare a state of emergency. And I feel that I mentioned those 2 points and let Shalon continue. One, the legacy of the troubles, and two, the everyday, present day conflict, contrived conflict between the government and the Guyana Teachers Union. The government must call in the teachers union, sit down around the table and say, we have a problem. Our children are involved. Let us solve the problem. Let us bring in the parents, let us bring in the teachers, let us bring in the government, let us bring in civil society. But that is not being done. And the violence continues to get worse. That's my bit.
Thank you so much. It continues to get worse. And those of you who are now joining us, good evening and welcome to Anansi Web Education with David Arthur Granger, former president of Guyana, and Shalon Washington, attorney at law. This reminds me, Mr. Granger, before we get to Ms. Washington, you did talk about the trauma and so forth and that kids are experiencing that. I recall I was just about maybe 12 years old on the quarantine. We were heading to school in a bus, a bunch of school children. That's when they had school buses and so forth. They called the bus Cayo. From the Tata bus days to the Brazilian bus, we called it Cayo on the quarantine. And a couple of us, dozen maybe or so, 2 dozens in the bus, and we saw a man chopped to death, pieces, at a village called Kilmarnock. And I never forgot that day. That was the first time I saw something like that. And then there were other folks who hung themselves in the village. We will see the rope around someone's neck. It has that traumatic effect on kids because I still remember all those things that I saw. And I can just imagine, as we all can, imagine what the kids who experienced the slaughtering of their fathers, shooting to death of their fathers in front of their other siblings and so forth, and their neighbors killed. It was horrible, those years from 2000 to when it supposedly ended. So, Ms. Washington, why has school violence become a major public education problem, ma'am?
School violence would be or is likely to become a major public education problem because it disrupts the learning environment. It causes a major disruption in learning environment. Now, you've narrated the situation with the bus. President Granger has spoken about the situation where the bus was attacked. And we have countless of situations where children have been in home and witnessed the police violently invaded their homes, violently beaten their parent, the father, the brother, or somebody in that home and drag them out to arrest them. Children in our society in Ghana has witnessed so many instances of police brutality. Then we have a whole other scope of domestic violence. There is a lot of violence occurring under the PPP administration. That is obvious. It's going to cause a disruption because when children witness this, it's going to affect them mentally, psychologically, emotionally. And then you drag them into a learning environment where sometimes they witness violence in the school also. They witness violence on the way to school. And then they have to learn with these images in their head. And it's difficult to put a child in an environment where they're subjected to experiencing or witnessing violence almost on a daily basis. And you tell them, okay, here you go. You have to learn, although you've witnessed so many things around you that could affect you, affect your ability to learn or retain any of the things in school. So we have a situation where it's going to be a public problem or epidemic because you're forced in a situation where you're in an environment, either in your village, at home, or in the school where you're witnessing all of these things. And the educational system in Guyana has not put anything in place to deal with this, to either provide counseling to these children to help them cope with what they're seeing. And you have a government, a corrupt government with a lot of violence they're encouraging. They're putting the police out. They're not training the police officers properly. We have that recent situation where the police officer forcefully entered the home of a Guyanese citizen. So we're living in a violent situation. Socio-economic conditions in Guyana permit the proliferation of violence in our communities, and the government isn't doing anything about it, and it trickles over to the school because it affects the children mentally, emotionally, psychologically, and there's no counseling provided for these children. So yes, it is a major problem, and it has to be dealt with at some point.
A major problem that has to be dealt with at some point. I recall early this year, there was a teacher somewhere out on the quarantine. I don't want to call the village name. Maybe I'll be wrong with that village, but one of the primary schools out on the quarantine, a teacher, her costume was, I believe, one of those storybook character with a big gun in her hand, and took a photograph in the classroom like that. That's where we're heading, and it's a sad situation. I know Mr. Granger spoke about the he called the A grade results based on access, attendance, and achievement, and so forth. That is great, and you can only have these things when you have a caring government, caring people who are responsible for the country. And no one seems to be addressing the issue of school violence. It will get out of hand if it's not nipped in the bud almost expeditiously. Before we move on to the next question, which has to do with the impact of school violence on children, especially in villages. Mr. Granger, do you wish to add anything else to the first question?
Well, there's a lot more that could be said about the first question, and I'm when you see situations like arson at in Georgetown, as far as Carasabai, many Guyanese, probably can't find Carasabai on the map. It is not something isolated, and we can't blame the parents, alone, or we can't blame, inner city, circumstances, situation. It seems to be widespread. We had a situation in Madia. What this tells me, there's some systemic disorder, that the system is not functioning. For example, I feel that a good school, a secondary, even a primary or secondary school, should have fields. Some of the old schools at Auckland and elsewhere were built by the Congregationalists or the Presbyterians 100 years ago. And they're barrack rooms, they're not modern educational facilities. And we need to shut those places down and take schools away from the towns, away from Regent Street and Church Street and Middle Street, and put them in the countryside. And when you see what happened, St. Joseph's used to be in Charlestown, but they moved to Thomas Lands. Queen's College used to be Brigham, moved to Thomas Lands. Tutorial used to be in 6th Street, moved to Thomas Lands. So you see, there has been a trend of moving schools away from the inner city so that the students have access to playing facilities, more space. But I don't know what is taking place now in terms of the infrastructure development, but we need to ensure that the children are given the sort of environment in which they could be properly educated. In addition to that, the arson that is taking place, the abuse that is taking place, and I do feel seriously that undermining the teacher's authority, this ceaseless battle between the government and the teachers' union, if it continues, it will have an impact in the classroom. If the government disrespects the teachers and the teachers' union, students will eventually disrespect the teachers and the teachers' union. And the government must stop pushing the teachers' union around, call them in, so that the students and parents could see that the government and teachers together are going to address this problem of violence. Coming back to the problem you mentioned about the 3As, APNU AFC provided school bus to improve attendance because there are too many dropouts. And nobody knows what happened to I don't care if it's called David G or David F or anything, but what we need is school buses for children everywhere. And this is important. We had school boats, we had bicycles for children, and those 3Bs, you worked. Dropouts were reduced, and children were able to attend school more frequently. Secondly, we need to provide access to children so that in areas like Akowini, you need proper schools so that children don't have to paddle an hour or 2 hours by canoe to get to school. Because when they get there, they're tired, they're hungry, and then they have to do the same thing at evening. And thirdly, you have to look at the achievement, what is happening at our grades. This is 2023. You know, it's not a question of growing hemp or flowers or roses. We have to deal with the problem of mathematics in the schools. That is the problem. And if teachers feel they're disrespected, if students feel they're not moving forward, people are going to drop out, people are going to migrate. And this is what is happening. People are getting fed up of the education system, the public education system.
Well said. David Otto Granger, former president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and attorney at law, Shallon Washington, based out in Brooklyn, New York. You know how to get in touch with Shallon. However, moving on, what's on my mind before we get quickly to the next, the second question is I wanted to ask Ms. Washington to inform us about her days attending school there in Linden and what type of violence existed back then, just out of curiosity, please.
Attending school in Linden, I think it was much, much more simpler than if someone was in the more urban areas. As you know, Linden is very rural. So the most violence you would have seen is domestic violence. That's the most I've witnessed as a child growing up in Linden. The neighbor having issue with his wife or something of that sort. Or occasionally we would have a school fight, like students fighting with each other during break time. But other than that, I had mostly a peaceful learning environment. We walked to school, there was no buses. And I think President Granger is absolutely right. Having children, having to find their way to school on their own. A lot of times the parent don't have the money to ensure that they pay the bus for the child to get to school. And that causes some sort of disruption in the child's ability to learn, because very often the child doesn't go to school. They don't make it to school. And in addition to not making it to school, there is the doorway some parents are opening for the child to be sexually exploited by allowing the child to walk themselves to school. You never know, there might be a predator on the way. Fortunately, in Linden was a very peaceful place. There wasn't a lot of violence at all. So we were allowed to walk to school. And if you were interested in learning, you would ensure that you go to school. But there was no proper method of keeping attendance record and ensuring that it was reported to your parent if you didn't show up to school. There's no oversight for that. And I think that kind of interfere in some way with or contributes to the rate of dropout in school, because a lot of times if you're absent, you're not able to learn. And if you're not able to learn, you wouldn't succeed because you don't know how to pass those exams to move on to the next level. I think if there was a high level of violence, it would have significantly impacted our ability to learn, because even the very domestic violence, sometimes you see that and it affects you mentally, much less a student put in an environment where they're witnessing any type of murder or police brutality. I think that would significantly disrupt your learning environment and your ability to comprehend and learn, because you might be daydreaming in the classroom. You might be thinking about something else when the teacher is teaching, and therefore you're not retaining anything. And if you don't retain, you cannot pass those exams to be promoted to the next level. So an environment like Linden, I would agree with Mr. Granger regarding moving the schools to better environment where the children are more amenable to learn, versus in a more disruptive environment where you're seeing too much and you're not focused on learning.
Well said, Ms. Washington. Appreciate that. I have no follow-up question as to your first fight in primary or secondary school, if at all you had any. I wouldn't ask you that. Neither am I going to ask Mr. Granger, since he mentioned Auckline out there on the quarantine. I'm tempted to ask him whether he got into any fist fight back then. I don't know if it's appropriate. Mr. Granger, what type of violence existed in Auckline Primary School, as I know it, Auckline Primary School back in your time?
Well, in my day, it was called Auckland Church of Scotland School. And the headmaster, Mr. Natu, was a Presbyterian, and the school was run by the church. As you know, across the road is the St. Saviour's Presbyterian Church. And it was a situation that I've described before. When I went to school at Bartica, you could look out of the window at Bartica School and see the St. John the Baptist Church. When I went to school at Sacred Heart in Georgetown, you know, it was actually in the church compound. It was part of the church building. And similarly, when I went to Comenius Moravian School, you could look out and see the church. So church and school were very close at Auckland, at Bartica, at Georgetown, and Moravian. And the commitment of the headmasters and the management of the school by the church were, I would say, on a different level to what is taking place now. But I wouldn't take it further than that. But it's important to show respect for the headmasters and the staff. And those days, you can see a man with a white sun helmet and a white jacket coming. He's a school inspector. And every headmaster had to look out to that school inspector. Attendance was important. We got certificates of attendance, gold or silver certificates. So the management of schools in colonial times was actually, I would say, superior. But those were better times, and we need not to throw the baby with the bathwater. We need to restore respect for teachers, and that is why I'm deeply concerned about the disrespect shown to the Guyana Teachers Union by the government of Guyana, by the PPP administration. Unless that problem is solved, the problem of violence won't be solved.
Gosh, we can't hold our breath on that being solved with what we're seeing currently in the country. All right, the next question. What has been the impact of school violence on children, especially in villages? The impact of school violence on children, especially in villages. Ms. Washington, you want to go first?
It's okay. I believe Mr. Granger would have a lot of content on that, but I will take a bite at it. I think in the villages, Mark, one of the problems is those villages are neglected. So socioeconomic conditions plays a big role in terms of the violence. And then the violence in turn would impact those students in a very negative way. In villages, you often see poor working conditions, poor living conditions, mostly the government neglect, because when we reference villages in terms of what we're familiar with in Guyana, it mostly refers to not all the times, but mostly African villages, Afro-Guyanese villages, because those villages were formed at a time when the slaves were newly emancipated. So when we reference villages and violence and the effect of those violence on the children, socioeconomic conditions impact those situations. And because of the poor living conditions, neglect, lack of job opportunity, lack of opportunities, period, violence tend to be a little bit more inclined or a little bit more escalated. The way police interact with the villagers, the way police officers violate the villagers' right. And to a large extent, once villages are neglected in a socioeconomic way, we have domestic dispute, domestic violence. We have dispute against neighbors. We've seen a recent situation where the neighbor were fighting over the land, I think in one of those villages in Georgetown. So violence is usually escalated where there's poor socioeconomic conditions. And where you have students living under those conditions, it tends to impact them mentally, psychologically, emotionally. So you go into the classroom, those students go into the classroom because they've been witnessing this type of environment. And oftentimes the violence becomes part of them, it becomes embedded in them, and they go to school with the same type of attitude. And also the other issue, if they've seen the teachers being disrespected by their parent, or being disrespected. You see on TV, you listen to the news, and you see all the way, the manner in which the government itself, the Ministry of Education, is dealing with the teachers. Then the student have that same kind of mentality towards the teachers. They're going to be disrespectful to the teachers. The violence that they carry, that they have in their mind, in their thoughts, in their memories, is going to cause a disruption. They might be themselves, that might themselves become violent towards others around them, towards the teacher. And violence often causes disruption in educational institution, in your learning institution. Because if you go there with that type of mentality, with the things you've seen, you're witnessing, the government of Ghana is neglecting villages. There's no attention being paid towards improving living conditions, towards stamping domestic violence out, towards eradicating the way the police interact with the villagers, the violent behavior, the what do you call it, extrajudicial killing that students are sometimes themselves exposed to witness. All these factors, you put them together, and it's a culmination of effect. We call it like the domino effect. One thing affects the others, and therefore all of these issues that I've discussed would impact the students' learning environment and cause a significant disruption. And those are some of the ways I think, Mark, that those are some of the ways I think it would have an impact on violence. The question is, what has the impact of school violence on children, especially in villages, be? So I think those are some of the way it would impact those students in those villages.
Well said, Attorney at Law Shellon Washington. We'll move over to His Excellency President David Granger on the second question as we are looking at the time. And let me just say good evening to all of you who are now joining us as well. Question, Mr. Granger, what has been the impact of school violence on children, especially in villages?
I think Shellon touched on this earlier in the conversation. Once you cannot get a proper learning environment, children start to drop out. We develop what we call a core of NEETs, N-E-E-T-S, children who are not in education and not in employment and not in training, N-E-E-T. And this is what happens if the education system falters. We end up with a lot of unemployment in rural areas, and children who drop out of school and cannot get good employment will become a problem. So that is one of the important impacts that we need to measure. That once there's violence, children stay away. Parents will keep their children away. I remember, during the Troubles, there was a case of Ms. Donna Herald, I think, in Buxton. She heard the shooting and ran to take her grandchild from the nursery, and she was killed. So parents and mostly mothers are concerned about what happens to the children, and if they feel that the schools are unsafe, they wouldn't send their children to school. And that is why we need to give them the buses, boats, and bicycles to help them to get the children to school safely. But the other thing we must bear in mind, and before we come off this point, is the PPP civic administration towards social cohesion. The fact that they could, like day one, throw social cohesion out of the window means that the opposite is now in effect, that instead of having a cohesive environment, we have now an environment which is fragmented. And in the rural areas, we all know, for historical reasons, economic reasons, some of the villages are populated mainly by Africans, some are populated mainly by Indians. So what happens when a school bus with African children is going through an Indian village? This is exactly what happened on the 6th of March, 2020. That the absence of social cohesion, the PPP's attitude to social cohesion resulted in social division. And this is an impact that is unfortunately ineradicable. And I wish it wasn't, I didn't have to use that word, but we need to chip away at this problem of social disunity. So I think those are two additions I'd like to make to this section of the program. That one is violence. Parents, mothers particularly, be concerned and withdraw their children from schools. And secondly, unless there is some restoration of the sort of practice of social cohesion, the state policy and social cohesion, which was laid down by AP and UFC. We are going to get further divisions in the villages, as well as the tongue with the villages too, are going to suffer. So that's my contribution there.
Thank you so much, Mr. Granger. We go to our final question here. How can school violence be eradicated, especially in villages? We spoke about the impact of the school violence on children in the villages, especially. And now the final question is, Ms. Shalon Washington, take the first all of this too again. How can school violence be eradicated, especially in villages?
I believe one of the ways to eradicate any issue at all, including violence, is through educating people, through taking steps, measures to ensure that whatever the root cause of it is dealt with on the highest possible level. And I think it starts with the government of Ghana. If you have the right government in place, the government first has to put policies in place that strictly deals with violence, including in the police force. They must start on that level, because a lot of the violence in Ghana stem from the death squad, the black clothes death squad, as we know them, who just practice extrajudicial killing. They just barge into the homes of Guyanese citizens, and they just take drastic measures rather than arresting people correctly and putting them through the court system. So I think it starts from the level of the people on the top. The government have to put policies in place that deals with wrongful conduct on the part of police officers. The police officers are trained that if you're dealing with a situation where there's a report of violence or an issue that needs a response, the police must be trained how to go to or approach that without engaging in violence, especially in the parts of the villages. And then you have on the level of the school district, they too, the board of not the Board of Education, we call them the Department of Education. They need policies in place to deal with how teachers interact with each other and how the teachers interact with the students. And the board itself need to treat the teachers with respect. The government of Ghana need to teach the teachers with respect. They need to put policies in place as to how they interact with these teachers. And then in turn, the teachers would have policies of how they interact with students to minimize violent interactions. And once that happens, then policies could be put into place as to how they're going to deal with bullying and violence in the school system, and how you must have some form of punishment or suspension if students engage in violent conduct in school. And the last thing that needs to be put into place to eradicate the violence in the school system is counseling. We must provide counseling to students who come from violent environments, who are exposed to violent situations. If the parent was killed through some violent conduct of the police or something of the sort, the Guyana government must put policies in place to deal with counseling, provide counseling for students in the school district. These are all part and parcel, I believe, of ways we could eradicate violence in the school system and even in the country itself.
Thank you so much, Attorney at Law Shalon Washington. Wonderful contribution this evening on the part of you. And folks always know they have a lawyer there in Brooklyn, New York to make contact with on any issues. All right, just give you that quick plug there. Let's go to Mr. David Otto Granger, who put a smile on his face. We going to ask him this final question for this week. How can school violence be eradicated, especially in villages? Before you do, I know it is something that your administration approached. Your administration did a hell of a good job in this particular area. And so you are the expert on this. Go right ahead, sir.
Well, we're not the experts, but what I would say, first of all, we need to have a commission of inquiry to find exactly where we are. I've been doing some research, and it does not seem that there is some record of all of the violent incidents taking place. And perhaps many teachers don't even bother to report because they're so frequent. They're everyday occurrences. And what we need to do is have a commission of intelligent persons which can advise. Just as we've had a commission of inquiry into the Mahadia fire to get advice on how to prevent a recurrence, we need a commission of inquiry into school violence to see how we could, you know, take measures to prevent recurrence. The second thing is there must be respect between the government, teachers, parents, and the school boards. That is a sine qua non. You cannot disrespect the teachers and expect the teachers to be respected by the students. You cannot leave the parents out of the solution. You cannot leave the unions out of the solution. And you cannot leave the school boards out. This is not happening. And we're seeing a lot of waywardness and lawlessness in the system because of the failure to communicate. I'd also add that there needs to be a positive effort to implement social cohesion in our textbooks, in our teacher training, in the practice in the classroom. There needs to be social cohesion. No point talking about, you know, things like, card of unity and one day. These things don't work. Man and mission. What needs to work is social cohesion, where children, Amerindian, African, Indian, mixed, Chinese, Portuguese children respect one another, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of the region they're from, and regardless of their religion. And we're not seeing any, people don't even mention the expression social cohesion. And I think that is part of the problem, that here you're trying to create a cohesive society without teaching the principles of cohesion. And what we need also is to have some sort of reporting vessel or vehicle, so that, on every time something happens, we don't have to read about it in Kaito News or Demerara Waves. The government will take a stand to ensure that violent incidents are dealt with properly. And we don't have a mechanism for removing or teaching children who have special needs. All children, unfortunately, I don't want to go into the background, but children are different. And some children have special needs. And sometimes the environment, it does not allow the one-size-fits-all solution. One size doesn't fit all. Some children need to be given special education so that they could catch up with those who are getting other forms of education. So some of these things are necessary to eradicate violence. If you've ever been a teacher and you have a disruptive child, a violent child in that class, it will be difficult for the teacher to make herself heard. 80% of the teachers are women. And that is by their own bullying. Because, when the teachers try to discipline a child, you see the parent come along. And the government, the Ministry of Education must understand that this violence, could be stamped out. And particularly in the villages, because the villages are social units. They're not just dormitories where people go to sleep. They're social units. And if the government tried to engage with the community leaders, I think we'd make better progress. We cannot run, a national education system only from the center. We have to speak to the regions, and the regions have to speak to the neighborhoods. And within those neighborhoods, we need to see, a new thinking emerge. For example, coming back to the old church schools, because I grew up with 4 church schools. These church schools were community concerns. The community of Bartica was concerned with what went on in St. John the Baptist. The community in Queenstown was concerned with what went on with the Moravian school. And if you keep out the community, keep out parents, keep out the unions, we're going to see a perpetuation of violence. If we want to eradicate it, the villages are the ideal places, the cradles for a new education system based on respect and based on social cohesion. And I'm afraid the government seems to be deaf. It's not listening. It's just going ahead with plans which ignore teachers, ignore parents, ignore, the rights. Every child in Ghana is entitled to an education system to be educated in a system that respects his or her differences and gives him or her quality education. It is not happening now. And I think the villages are a good place to start to turn the tide on this violence that we have in the education system at present.
Well said, President David Otagraja there on the question of how can school violence be eradicated, especially in villages. I recall on the quarantine at Wellington Park Primary School, my first teacher in Prep A was my aunt, Petronella Austin, née Benshop. She's now deceased. And my Prep B teacher was my neighbor, Miss Claudette Pistano. So I had no way of being disruptive in the class as much as I was tempted to. And so the village was there. You guys are correct. The village was there. So even if I was disrupted, I'll get, of course, sometimes, I'll get some lashes from my aunt, who was my prep teacher, some lashes from Miss Claudette.
No correction.
Correction. All across. We don't see that any longer. We got to get the village back involved. Thank you guys so much. Yeah, sorry.
Mike, just one thing, I just want to reemphasize one thing that President Granger said, which, goes hand in hand with counseling, the social cohesion part. In order to get mutual respect from everyone, we got to counsel these children, and they are the most impressionable people in society. And the best place to start with social cohesion, because we have these older folks in the government, they just preach discrimination and segregation. But if you start with molding the minds of the youth, the mind is very impressionable, and teach them to honor and respect each other, respect their peers through counseling them. I think that's one of the best way we can go in terms of eradicating this, especially in our younger generation in the villages.
Well said. And then the policia, they have to do their part as well.
Well, Mark, if you start with the children, the children become police officers. But if you start programming their minds at the early age, by the time they grow up and they become police officers, they'll change their conduct and treatment towards the people.
And so we want members of the policia, they must do their job as well. And with that, we say buenas noches, Mr. Granger. Buenas noches.
Good night. Good night, Mark. Good night, audience. Good night, gentlemen.
Good night, Ms. Washington. Good night,
guys. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Mr. Granger. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah. And we will see you guys back next week, same place, same time, right here on 107.1 FM on Anansi Web Education. Good night and have a great rest of the evening, everyone, all of you. God bless you.
She fat like a butter, and she marble like a chow. Oh, smallest is still on me mind. Smallest is a good time. Never had so little children. I'm gonna sing and dance, and that's really admire them.
What they're singing?
On your carpet, you must be like the roses, all you need, bright and shining. You must be, and show me the one. Love the best. When I marry, I give you the ring. First the girls, second the boys. Sunday, Monday, afternoon, we will spend our honeymoon. Oh, smallest is still on my mind. Smallest is a good time. Some little children. I'm gonna sing and dance, let's really admire them.
Join the singing.
Hold my house on fire. You're my runaway. He ran for the police.